So I'm going to talk about business reinvention, and specifically, I'm going to talk about career reinvention. And I'm going to do that by taking you through the highlights and the lowlights of my career and how I went from being an aerospace engineer to now an author. And before I do that, let me tell you the two things that I learned. I actually learned a hell of a lot more than that. But there's two things that I want to kind of bring out in this speech. The first is that the reinvention of yourself and the reinvention of your career is based on your skills. And it's the development of skills and then taking them and applying them to something new. The second part, and this is kind of maybe the dirty little secret about reinvention, is reinvention requires destruction. And there's two ways that you can destroy a career. You can do it consciously, intentionally. In other words, say, I'm going to take these skills and I'm going to apply them to another business or in another job type. The other way is unintentional destruction, and it's called failure. And failure, like intentional, is a great teacher, and it forces you to reinvent yourself. So let me kind of take you through my experience of both intentional and unintentional recreation. So I started out as an aerospace engineer out of college. I was a pretty good student, and I got into the aerospace field. I worked on the Space Shuttle and the MX missile. But it turns out that, and my business card was rocket scientist, so I was a rocket scientist. But it turns out that rocket science is kind of difficult. It's very complex, and I was good at conceptualizing, but I wasn't very good at the rote day-to-day number crunching. So I was moderately successful as a rocket scientist. I was a pretty good rocket scientist. But I had aspirations to do bigger things, and so I kind of wandered a little bit in that role. And then I got the opportunity to write a proposal. It was a small proposal for a NASA contract. And ends up, we won the contract. And I did a couple more. Oh, now I realized I had these skills. I had skills to conceptualize and to write and put things on paper. Then I got, just by sheer luck, I was given the opportunity to write and be part of the space station proposal team. There was maybe a dozen of us. We ended up winning that contract. It was a several billion-dollar contract, so we all got promoted. It was great. And I went through a series of promotions that was very successful and started to get a little bit arrogant and wanted to make more money, and it really wasn't going to happen in the aerospace business. So I looked around at some of my friends and looked at who was making money, and there was this friend of mine that was selling money. He was in the leasing business, selling financing to small businesses. So, and he was making just tons of money. And I was like, hey, if I can figure out this aerospace thing, I can figure out this leasing thing. So I left, and I left my aerospace job. One day I had a job here in Washington, D.C. I was the aerospace liaison for the McDonnell Douglas Corporation. One day I'm calling on Casper Weinberger. Next day I quit. Next week I'm calling on dry cleaners in New Hampshire, and they won't even take my call, and it was real culture shock for me. And I realized, and I struggled, and I didn't completely fail just because I worked so hard, but I didn't have the right skills, and the skills that you needed for this particular job were cold calling skills, and I didn't have the heart for cold calling, and so I really struggled, and I struggled for 3 or 4 years. And then one day I was working late. My wife was pregnant. I really needed to make money. I'm working late. I'm the only one at the company, and I get a phone call. And it's from a previous customer of this particular company. And they wanted to finance new equipment. No cold call. Did the deal, made a lot of money, and I'm like, God, that was great. Like, how can I do more of that where I don't have to do the cold call, but do the kind of the back room thing and the negotiating? I was pretty good at negotiating. So I developed a business model where I went and I took all of the previous customers and I created this thing called a lease line of credit. And then I did a mass market. I took all of the previous customers and I sent them like this faux credit card, asking them, activate your card And when you need financing, we'll finance the equipment for you, send it to a bunch of small businesses. Well, anyways, we sent about 3,000 of those out, and the phones rang off the hook. I went from being probably the worst salesman, or at the bottom of the sales ladder, to being the best salesman within a 2-month time frame. Had more leads than I knew what to do. And I was like, okay, now I got it. This is great. This is something that I can leverage off of. So I decided to start my own company. Took some funding from some family and friends. And the cool thing about this particular business model is everything is phone, FedEx, and fax, and direct mail. So you can do it anywhere. So I located it up in Lake Tahoe, right on the shores of Lake Tahoe, and started my own company. And pretty much from the start, it was successful. I was really working this business model, and I studied the hell out of direct marketing, figured out about modeling, and 1 year into it, I had 100 employees. 2 years into it, I had almost 300 employees, and we were funding probably $20 to $30 million worth of business. I had started this with about $50,000 in savings, and after 2 years, I had $2 or $3 million in cash just sitting there. And then the companies that because I was just brokering deals, the companies that I were broken to were like, hey, Dave, we'd be interested in buying your company. I was like, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. Maybe that's how I can get the big hit, the big financial hit that I was looking for. So I took bids. And I got 2 really good, legitimate bids from companies that I was doing business with. One of them was from GE Capital, and it was for $25 million. And the other was from a bank in Philadelphia, and that was for $50 million. So I'm like, 25, 50, which one are you going to take, right? I took the $50 million. And was pretty excited about this, right? And the bank's like, okay, we just need to do some due diligence, and then maybe 30 days we'll fund and you'll become part of a company. I had no venture capital. I pretty much owned the company myself. The employees had a little bit of stock ownership in it, but there was $50 million coming my way. So they came in, did their due diligence. I wasn't worried about that because I had prepared the books myself. Are you sensing something coming here? So I get a call, come to New York, we're going to close the deal. So I do. I walk into this conference room, and I'm sitting there, and I'm waiting. I got a suite at the Four Seasons. I am going to become a multi-millionaire, right? So the president of the bank walks in, and he walks in with 2 lawyers and no paperwork. I'm like, something's wrong. And he says, Dave, have you read the papers this morning, the newspapers this morning? And I'm like, no. He's like, we've been shut down by the FDIC. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. He's like, yeah. And he goes on to explain that they had been doing seconds, mortgage seconds, nothing to do with my business, or nothing to do with the leasing business, but they had been doing these second mortgages that were highly leveraged, and the FDIC shut them down. So not only, I was told, am I not getting my $50 million, but they were warehousing all of this paper that I was doing. So he was also saying, like, and that $30 million in warehouse lines, we can't fund that either. So I walked out of there, not with a $50 million check, but with a $30 million bill. So the first thing I did was I called my friends at GE Capital. The $25 million is looking pretty damn good now, right? So I called up my friend Tom, and I'm like, Tom, I got a problem. I need to talk to you. And he's like, hey, yeah, fine. I need to talk to you. It's funny that you called. And I was like, hey, I'm on the next plane. I'll see you tomorrow morning. So I fly to Tom. I'm like, okay, Tom and I had a really good relationship. And I'm like, I'm still wondering, are they still going to honor their $25 million? I'm thinking even $10 million sounds pretty good at this point, right? Because I've got this $30 million bill here. So I get to the next day, I walk into Tom's office, and there's boxes all over the floor. And he's like, I quit this morning. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. So it's not that funny. I'm glad you guys are getting a kick out of this story. I don't tell this story very often. So he's like, I can introduce you to the interim president, but interim presidents aren't really interested in doing deals for other people. So I pretty much walked out of there a broken man. I will say that I was pretty arrogant. I figured I could market my way out of it, right? And I tried to for the next 6 months. I fired about half the staff, about 150 people, and these were my friends, and it was just devastating. Within 6 months, we were pretty much out of business. So I had gone from literally having millions in my pocket to, by the end of the year, having to file for personal bankruptcy. And then I was stuck, and I'm like, I'm 45 years old. What am I going to do, you know? So I did what any self-respecting businessman would do. I did a lot of thinking, and I did a lot of drinking. And then about a year later, after doing a lot of thinking, a lot of drinking, I was doing a little bit of consulting. I called Tom up. And Tom had become the president of Turbotax, and a bunch of GE people had took over Intuit, the software company that makes Turbotax. And so I asked them, I was like, hey, I need some consulting work. And they're like, hey, great, why don't you come here, come to Intuit and see if you can figure out something with a direct marketing program for Turbotax. And so I took that job, and I really needed a win. And I was lucky enough that there was a really simple idea on the table. And any Turbotax users here? Yeah. The cool thing about the Turbotax business model is that it obsoletes itself every year. So you have to buy the software every year. So my idea was like, why are we asking people and asking them to buy the software from us? Why don't we just put the software on a disk, put a unlocking mechanism in it, and send it out? And Tom's like, wow, that's actually a pretty good idea. So we did that. It went out. A good direct marketing program will pull 5 or 6%. This particular program pulled 60%. Hugely successful. I mean, just blew us all away. The president then of Intuit came to me and he's like, hey, we really like the way you think, and we really like this process that you went through to come up with an idea. He's like, why don't you come and become the head of innovation at Intuit? And I was like, oh, what's that do? Oh, well, you'll just come up with new ideas and you'll teach other people to come up with new ideas. And so I took that job, ended up a couple years later, Tom, the president of Turbotax, and I left, started our own tax software company, and then in 2005, we sold it to H&R Block. And it was like a full circle for me. And it was a tough thing to go through. And I looked at like all of the skills and all of the crap really that I had to go through. And I realized there was one skill for reinvention. There was this marketing skills and all this kind of other stuff, but there was this one skill in particular that was really important and that I developed and that was so important for reinvention. And it's the skill to pick yourself up off the floor after you've gotten your ass kicked. And that's the skill that a reinventor really needs. So that's it. Thanks, you guys.